Because if we look at it, what is decision-making? Decision-making means directing our attention to the consequences of a choice, to our feelings, to our values, and making a decision. But if all these have been laid out under the hats, the decision has actually designed itself. So when you come to the end, the decision is very often self-evident. Last year in England, there was a write-up on the 6 hats in the Financial Times, and the following week I had a letter from a fellow who said he was in the country with his wife and they couldn't decide whether to buy this particular house or not. And they'd been arguing about it for 2 or 3 hours. He then said to his wife, let's try that 6 hats thing I read about in the paper last week. And they tried it. He said within 3 minutes they had a decision. In other words, laying things out clearly, rather like laying out a roadmap, the decision is often self-evident. So blue hat at the beginning, blue hat at the end. In between, it will vary with what is being done. For example, if you are assessing something, then you would start with the yellow hat, because if under the yellow hat, when you're making your strongest effort to find benefits and values, if you cannot find many benefits and values, that is the end of it. There is no merit in that idea. You don't even need to use the black hat. But if under the yellow hat you find lots of benefits and values, and then you come to the black hat, and now you find lots of problems and difficulties and so on, at least now you're motivated to overcome those problems because you have seen the benefits. But if you start off with a black hat before you've seen any benefits and you find a lot of problems and difficulties, you're going to dismiss that idea without ever having explored the benefits. So in general, in assessment, it makes sense to start with the yellow hat. After the black hat, you may then use the green hat, even if you're using it elsewhere, to see how you can overcome some of those difficulties. Some of them you can immediately say we can overcome so-and-so. Some of them you can't. You have to note the ones you can't, come back to it later, think about that particular point. If it's a neutral situation, after the first blue hat, you may want to use the white hat. Let's lay out the information. Then you may want to use the green hat. Let's think of alternatives, possibilities. Then you may explore those alternatives and possibilities with the black hat and with the yellow hat on each of them. If it's a situation where you believe that there are strong feelings, strong emotions, after the first blue hat, you may want to use the red hat. For example, before the elections in South Africa, they asked me to teach the 6-hat system, the framework, to the heads of all the peace accord committees in the different townships in South Africa, and they had to solve all the local problems, and they always would start with the red hat. Let people sound off, let them express their feelings, let them express their emotions, and then there was no need to try and feed these into everything for the rest of the meeting. So in that case, you start with the red hat. Get your feelings out on the table. You can use the red hat later. Later, you can feed in a red hat to see if the feelings have changed or if they are still the same. So, red hat. There wouldn't be any point in starting with the red hat if there were not existing feelings, because you wouldn't ask people to adopt feelings if they were not already there. Also, in a few cultures, there's a danger that if you start with the red hat and the senior person, teacher or boss, expresses his or her feeling, there's a danger that everyone may just try and agree with that feeling. In that case, don't start with the red hat. Towards the end of the thinking, you would, of course, have your blue hat at the end. And usually, if any sort of action or suggestion is made, at some point you would want the black hat. What are the dangers? What are the risks? What is the downside? After the black hat, you may also insert a red hat. Now, if the black hat says that's a bad idea, but the red hat says, I still like it, that doesn't mean that you're going to override the black hat. What it means is you may dismiss that particular way of carrying out the idea, but say, but I still like the fundamental idea, in which case you go back to the beginning and try to design a better way of using that idea. even at the end, after your final blue hat, which is your conclusion hat, you may also put in a red hat. The red hat says, what do we feel about our thinking? What do we feel about our thinking on that subject? Are we happy with it? Do we feel we're still uncertain? Do we feel we didn't do it justice? And so on. So the red hat is permission, legitimacy to express feelings, emotions, and so on. Now, of course, those will vary with different cultures. If in Japan someone says, I'm not totally happy with your idea, that means that person thinks it's the worst idea they've ever heard. In other cultures, unless you say that's the lousiest idea you've ever heard, people think you quite like it. So the level at which emotions are pitched will vary from culture to culture. But the red hat gives you permission to express your feelings, your intuition. So what I've been talking about is a very simple tool, a very simple framework, so that instead of trying to do everything at once, we separate things out and do them one after the other. This is not difficult to do. There are many hundreds, thousands of schools using it from the age of 5 up, not just up to adult, but up to adults in very senior positions. I just mentioned one example before. For instance, another example is Prudential Insurance in the United States, by far the biggest insurance group in the world. And at one time, their chief executive, Ron Barbaro, and he used to use the 6 hats all the time. At any meeting, he said, this is the best way of getting the best value of the thinking of the people involved. So we're looking at right up to senior adults. Very good in conflict situations. In South Africa, the Sowetan newspaper, which is the biggest black newspaper in Africa, I think, they could never get agreement at editorial board level. They adopted the hat principle. Now they use it at every meeting. In Paris, France, every month there's a meeting between the farmers who grow the vegetables and the people who sell them at the market in Paris. These were always very acrimonious adversarial meetings. The farmers used to accuse the marketers of not getting a good enough price. The marketers used to accuse the farmers of not producing good enough quality. Someone introduced the hats. They had the best meeting they've ever had. Now they use that framework for all their meetings. One time in Florida, Apple Computer had a meeting which apparently was in total chaos. They introduced the hats, made sense, and got a very valuable meeting. So we're looking at a very simple, very usable framework. Now, the point which I want to emphasize is this does not mean that our traditional argument system is bad, any more than the front left wheel of a car is bad. It is excellent, but by itself it is not sufficient. It is not sufficient. I don't have to say that's a bad wheel in order to say we need other wheels as well. Now, what the 6 hats framework does is that instead of argument, instead of just drift, instead of confusion, instead of trying to do everything at once, we can have parallel thinking. The fact that the hats have colors on our hats is only a mental framework which enables us to do it. There's nothing magic about it, but if you said, let's have critical thinking or let's have positive thinking, creative, very weak. The framework of the hats makes it much more direct, much more tangible, sticks in the mind. And as I say, it's usable literally from 5-year-olds up to adults in very senior positions. That's why around the world, in different countries, different schools, many teachers, both primary and secondary, are now using the hat system. For instance, at Singapore, there's 2 people who run a school for thinking there on Saturday mornings, and they found that these were youngsters, about 8 or 9, and they'd asked them to write on a particular subject in the beginning. And the youngsters would write 2 lines on the subject. Once they had the 6 hats framework, they would write 40 lines on that subject. Huge changes, because the hats allow you to scan your experience much more fully, as I said with the explorer going into a situation. So we're looking at a framework which works very well, a simple tool that is increasingly widely used. And now I'm coming to the end of my talk, and I'll take some of the questions you may ask and try and answer them. So at this point, I'm going to stop my talk, and just to say that I've been looking at, indeed you've been looking at with me, a very simple framework for parallel thinking, constructive thinking, creative thinking, cooperative thinking, called the 6 thinking hats. So now I'll take some questions.